This is Cassandra. What is the first thing you think when you look at this image? Look at her widened eyes staring into the distance, at her hands. She's crazy, right? If I told you that's what everyone around her thought, I'm sure you'd believe me. Because it's true. Everyone around her thought she had lost her mind. But what if I told you every single word Cassandra professed was true? It seems hard to believe when you look at that image, doesn't it? And that's because crazy is the interpretation of Cassandra that has stood the test of time. Cassandra, like so many other ancient women, was silenced. A curse placed upon her by the very God who gave her the gift of prophecy meant that not a single word she spoke was believed. Every event of the Trojan War, every death, every rape that happened during those 10 years could have been avoided if anyone had believed a word she'd said. But she was ignored. Why? Because she refused to sleep with Apollo, a god, and much more importantly, male. So Cassandra is probably the most obviously silenced Homeric woman. But there are so many others, myriads of women who never got to tell their own stories. So, what happens when we finally let women speak for themselves? Well, in recent years, writers like Constanza Casati, Natalie Haynes, and Krista Wolf have begun to do just that, retelling classical stories from the perspectives of the women inside them. Through their voices, we begin to hear what was lost. Incredible stories of anger, of strength, of grief, and over everything else of a complexity that was left completely untouched in the originals. Because retelling these stories isn't just a literary act, it's an act of justice. We aren't rewriting history, we're restoring it. I assume you all know what this is from, right? The Trojan War. What is the first thing you think of when I say Trojan War? The horse, I assume? Maybe also Achilles? Those of you who like opera may even have thought of Idomeneus, and I assume you will all have thought of Helen. Yes, Helen of Troy, epitome of feminine beauty, the face who launched 1,000 ships. But did any of you think immediately of Iphigenia, whose death allowed those 1,000 ships to be launched in the first place? So this raises the question, what role do women play in Homer's version of the Trojan War? They are little more than pieces to be traded and used in a game dominated entirely by men. No one thinks of Nausicaa or Andromache or Chryseis, at least not immediately. Even Helen, one of the few women who comes to mind, is little more than an object. Or think of Athena. She's the guardian angel of Odysseus. She's an Olympian goddess, but she has to dress up as mentor, a man, to be taken seriously at all. But Greek literature isn't the only thing that forgets about women, because the language itself does the same. In the words of Natalie Haynes, a woman far more eloquent than I am, Greek uses the masculine and the feminine, but it prefers the masculine. I know. So no matter how many girls in a room, if boys are there too, the word children takes the masculine ending, and the girls just disappear. But there is one special kind of woman who doesn't disappear, and that is the woman who doesn't conform to societal rules. No matter when or where they lived, across history, these women have been united by the way they are presented as an example to other women. And one such example is Clytemnestra, known across Greek mythology for the murder of Agamemnon, king of Mycenae, her husband. So it's shocking when the only story presented to you is what Aeschylus writes in the Oresteia, sure. But her story goes back much further than those 2.5 hours of Agamemnon, the first play of the series. So to give you a brief backstory, as a young woman, she marries Tantalus, who was then slain alongside her infant child by Agamemnon. And then her father, Tyndareus, king of Sparta, marries her to this Agamemnon, who's just killed her husband and baby, and sends her off with him to Mycenae to rule. Around the same time, Agamemnon's brother Menelaus marries her sister Helen, Helen of Sparta at that point, and he stays with her in Sparta to rule. Now, at this point, the sisters' paths diverge, and she has a few children, including Iphigenia, who will become extremely relevant shortly. So, when Helen runs off or is abducted by Paris of Troy, it's unclear which, due to once again shockingly lacking feminine narrative. All of the Greek kings who pledged their allegiance to Menelaus join him to go and win her back in Troy. But for months, they're stuck on a piece of land with no wind to carry them anywhere, let alone Asia Minor. Eventually, an oracle tells these kings that it's because the goddess Artemis thinks the human cost of the conflict will be so huge that they need to lose something valuable to them in return. So Agamemnon, without batting an eyelid, declares his eldest daughter Iphigenia is to be married to Achilles, the greatest of the Greek heroes. It would have been an absolute honor for any young woman to be married to this incredibly famous hero. So Iphigenia arrives where the kings are, and thinking she's going to be married to Achilles, but then she's seized by guards and sacrificed like cattle at the altar. But the wind resumes, so the kings are happy. Clytemnestra, however, is left to grieve for a decade and nurse her resentment against the man who'd killed not one, but two of her children. So if you ever go to read Homer and see Agamemnon referred to as brilliant, or wide-ruling, or lord of men, think, who made that happen? It was one woman's grief that would mean that she'd become vilified for centuries to come. So Clytemnestra is framed as this monstrous cautionary example, a wife who breaks social order by murdering her husband. But when her narrative is reclaimed, her actions stop being senseless evil. They become a response to extreme gendered violence by a patriarchal society. Reclaiming her voice radically changes our moral understanding of the story. And then, around the same time Clytemnestra is murdering her husband, Odysseus, king of Ithaca, tries to make it home and encounters a few trials and a few adventures across the way, some of which include the Cyclops Polyphemus, or Scylla and Charybdis, who finish off the crew he had left, which hadn't perished at the hands of other monsters. And one very famous story is Circe of the Isle of Aiaia, basically famous for turning his men into pigs. But then, resourceful Odysseus seduces and tricks her, and lives on her island for a year as her lover. Just another example of a woman's sexuality being her undoing. But let's look at the story differently. Half a dozen unknown armed men walk up to her house and treat her space like a convenience stop, not someone's sacred domain. We talk about how Circe does not respect the rules of Xenia, the ancient Greek laws of guest friendship, but do the men? And then she turns them into pigs. Homer frames her as a dangerous sorceress who needs to be tamed, but really it's defensive magic. Solitary women have every reason to use whatever power they have when faced with armed soldiers in their home. So when Odysseus comes to save them, we all glorify his wit and intervention, but really he runs into Hermes on the way there, who tells him step by step how to defeat her. And Hermes and Circe are ex-lovers. It's just another way the patriarchal divine order makes sure no woman gets too strong. So when Circe and Odysseus meet, he overpowers her magically with a sword. Sorry, just with a sword. And she can't fight back magically because of Hermes. So in the classic version, she submits, but really it's a situation where she has to de-escalate male aggression in her own home. And then they become lovers, as I mentioned, but the context is quite complicated because she is a solitary woman living on an island, and he is the divinely protected leader of a large crew of armed men. There is no equal footing. But for the year in which he lives on her island, she is the expert. She tells him how to navigate the supernatural world ahead. She tells him to visit Tiresias, the blind prophet in the underworld. She tells him how to overcome Scylla and Charybdis. And she tells his crew not to touch the cattle of Helios. It's not her fault they don't listen. And when he leaves, she isn't abandoned because she isn't pining. His departure is about his quest, not her worth. She is a powerful goddess who hosted a hero, helped him, and let him continue his journey. But her life remains her own. So Circe's story teaches us that classical myth often frames women's power as danger and their autonomy as moral failure. But when her narrative is reclaimed, she is no longer a seductive sorceress who needs to be tamed. She becomes instead a solitary woman defending her home, navigating unequal power, and using intelligence as a means of survival. Reclaiming her story teaches us how patriarchal storytelling has distorted justice, consent, and heroism, and asks us to question, once again, whose voices have shaped the stories we inherit. And then, about 8 years after Odysseus leaves Circe's island, he finally makes it home to Ithaca and saves his faithful wife Penelope from the suitors. Or does he? When Odysseus leaves for Troy, Penelope is left holding political power in a world that pretends women don't rule. Even the suitors don't appear because she is alluring. They are opportunists trying to seize her husband's throne by marrying her. Her emotional restraint doesn't only allow her to stay faithful to her husband, it allows her to protect her own independence in her kingdom. She stalls them with wit through the weaving ruse, because open resistance will get her deposed in a more conclusive way. She is resisting quietly because open resistance will get her killed. And what's more, this isn't only protecting herself, she's protecting her child, Telemachus, the legitimate heir to the throne. Even when he grows up and wants to assert his dominance over the suitors, she ultimately needs to keep him protected and alone, and puts up with him overriding and disrespecting her in public, all to keep him safe and to keep the peace. She's walking a tightrope between maternal authority and her son's ego. And then she interrogates the beggar Ethon with razor-sharp intelligence, even though it's heavily implied that she knows he is Odysseus. The bow test isn't romantic. It's a rather intelligent last attempt to avoid getting married. And what's more, she withholds recognition until she is sure. The bed test is her demanding proof of identity, and that's agency. The right to decide, after 20 years of male coercion, who has access into one's life. Penelope's story teaches us that women's resistance in myth is often quiet and strategic. When her narrative is reclaimed, she isn't only a passive symbol of resistance waiting to be saved. She becomes a strong political actor defending her throne, her kingdom, her son, and herself under constant threat. Reclaiming her story shows us that resistance in myth doesn't always have to look like violence or spectacle. Sometimes it looks like agency and the right to decide, at last, who has access to one's life. Because in the end, the Trojan War isn't just the story of kings chasing glory across the sea or heroes clashing on bloody battlefields. It's a tapestry woven just as much by the lives of the women who shaped it, endured it, and survived its aftermath. Because the Trojan War wasn't only built by these male warriors, it was also Cassandra, who stops being a madwoman, but a truth-teller punished for her refusal. Clytemnestra, who stops being evil, but instead a mother pushed past any human limit. And Circe and Penelope stop being footnotes in the epics of men and become what they always were, the pillars holding up the entire narrative. I think, in the end, classical literature requires us to show a little bit of empathy towards minorities, for the simple reason that the people who wrote the myth found it easier to empathize with people they could relate to. So remember that the Trojan War isn't only Achilles' rage or Odysseus' suffering or Agamemnon's greed, it's also Cassandra's warnings, Clytemnestra's grief, Circe's power, or Penelope's endurance. And next time you're exposed to any story in the media, question it. Thank you.